From Yellowhammer News, this is One Day at a Time, presented by Longleaf Recovery and Wellness. Join me, Laurie, as I speak with industry leaders about the challenges and solutions surrounding substance use disorder and mental health issues facing so many people here in Alabama. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of One Day at a Time, where we're putting a priority on having important conversations about substance use disorder and mental health in Alabama. I'm your host, Laurie, and I have 17 years of continuous recovery. Joining me today is Alabama's Attorney General, Steve Marshall. Mr. Attorney General, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good to be with you.
So how are we doing in the state of Alabama when it comes to services for folks who are struggling with mental health and substance use issues?
Yeah, I think, let me give the perspective of kind of roughly 8 years as AG, which is, I think we're trending in the right direction. One of the things that I do believe has taken place over the last several years is a greater recognition of the issue. And I think maybe this a little bit of a national trend too, that maybe there is more transparency around mental health questions and the impact on families, and the fact that maybe we're beginning as a society to get past this idea that mental health is a character flaw and that physical health is a different issue, when now I think we are becoming much more aware that they are one and the same and not treating them differently. And we've seen the emergence of things like our crisis centers across the state, allowing opportunities for help on an urgent basis that maybe that we haven't had before. Because there's no doubt that we've seen over the last decade plus a transformation of how it is that we approach mental health services from the state side. Before there were large facilities and inpatient areas, and now really going into a community-based model. And I don't know that transition has always been easy or effective. And so I do think we've seen leadership and Commissioner Boswell now sort of pushing that with her staff. And I think that's been very constructive, although there's clearly more that we can do. But the other thing I think we're also seeing is more and more private providers enter the space and doing good work and making sure that there are options available. There's no doubt that the state's focus is probably more in indigent services and those that struggle to get access. But I think that we are seeing more innovative and effective programs that are coming online that I'm encouraged are going to help, particularly around the issue of addiction.
To what extent do you think COVID brought about more of a focus on the importance of taking care of people when it comes to mental health issues and substance use issues?
Yeah, I think COVID was made things more problematic for a while, particularly around addiction. And that, one of the successful things, and like I'm preaching to the choir when I talk to you about this, is the communal aspect of group therapy, the accountability that comes with that. And look, as a society, we tend to be social beings. And there's no doubt that during COVID, we saw a setback in some of the gains that we had around opioid addiction, for example.
Because people were staying home.
They were staying home, right.
And isolating and drinking more and using more drugs because they could not go outside. They could not do the things that they were normally doing.
No, and sadly, when you see a spike in revenue for the state from alcohol sales, that probably tells you something, right?
It does.
Everybody remembers the lines at the ABC store that were there.
Yeah.
But it was also, I think, a moment to probably refocus a little bit. And no doubt there was an acknowledgement that COVID has impacted lots of tentacles in lots of areas that are outside of just mental health. But it did give us a reset about the direction that we were going and things we were doing. Again, particularly around the fight that I've been involved with dealing with opioid addiction.
For many years, Alabama led the nation in the number of opioids prescribed per person. Where does that stand now?
Yeah, it's much better, but we still have work to do. I'll back up and just share a story. When I first came on board, Kay Ivey was like 6 weeks after me. That's kind of, we both really took office about the same time, being elevated for different reasons into the positions. And I remember going to Governor Ivey saying, look, opioids are a problem and we have no comprehensive plan in the state to try to be able to deal with it. And we need to work collectively across multiple disciplines to try to figure out where Alabama's going. I think that was a little bit at the time that AGs were beginning to think about initiating litigation to get recovery of funds. But it was more than simply saying, let's recover money. We got to have a plan on how we're going forward, because part of my background before then was as a DA, and we had a really robust drug testing program for those of our offenders. And we began to see this transition away from methamphetamine to opioids, and yet we didn't necessarily have the tools to deal with that as effectively. And so really proud that the Governor Ivey established through executive order our opioid task force. And I tell you that story only because one of the first, I think, really success stories of the opioid task force was developing and enhancing our PDMP, which is that database that all our prescribing patterns are shown so that doctors had more information, and then working with our medical community to create more training for doctors, more awareness of prescribing patterns, but also forcing, and it's probably the only way to use it, maybe there's a gentler word, but it really was coerced, the use of the PDMP for prescribing opioids in certain amounts or for certain durations.
Can you explain what PDMP stands for?
Prescription Drug Monitoring Database.
Thank you.
And it's what our pharmacists and physicians have access to, because the idea being that you don't want to have a patient on drugs that could be counteracting one another, but it also gave our doctors the ability to understand when people may be drug shopping.
Doctor shopping. And I'll speak from experience. I was not a pill person. My drugs of choice were alcohol and cocaine. But I know plenty of people who are in recovery with me now who doctor shopped. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I used to live in New York State, and it was one of the first states to crack down on doctor shopping. And I thought, that's a great idea. I hope the other states follow suit. And obviously, we've seen that now in other states, such as Alabama. So that's come a long way, would you say?
Yeah, I clearly come a long way. It took an investment of about $1.4 million, but it also became more user-friendly for the physician, a dashboard that helped them identify those patients that truly were doctor shopping and gave the physician the opportunity then to move that person into treatment and to recommend that as the next step in their progress. But, you know, look, Alabama, when I came as AG, we were number one in opioids per capita in prescribing. We were number one per capita in opioid use disorder diagnosis. And then uniquely, our opioid overdose deaths aren't tracked as well based on kind of how our coroner system works. And so we underreport those. But even when we're underreporting per capita, we were still pretty high on the list. And so there was no doubt that this was a significant, and I would say the preeminent public health issue that we felt we dealt with as a state and as we did in a nation. You know, when COVID came in, sadly, it probably caused us to be distracted from the progress that we were making there. But I do give our boards, both from the dentist and doctors both, because, you know, people don't think about dentists really were prescribing significant amounts of opioids. And look, if you've had tooth pain, you want that, right? But we
tooth
also
pain
saw
is very serious.
Yeah, we saw some concerns there, but we've made good progress, and I think that's been the profession working to enhance doctors' understanding. Because, you know, one of the things that came from the litigation, I hope some people have seen the documentaries out there tracking kind of the Sackler family and the rise of opioids.
And we're going to get to the settlement money in just a minute.
Yeah, but how opioids were marketed to begin with, you know,
as non-addictive.
And you know, and even this insane idea that if somebody showed up addicted, it means maybe they weren't getting enough, and it was a kind of a feigned symbol of addiction that really wasn't. It was the body needing more. And, you know, there's so many, you know, people sometimes say, well, what do you think caused this? Well, there's no singular cause, but there's no doubt that the way in which opioids were sold to physicians, particularly around OxyContin, was absolutely insane. And what it did to prescribing patterns, all for profit, has led to many of the problems we have. And then, of course, you know, we talk about opioids and people think typically about prescribed opioids, but the driver right now is around fentanyl.
And that was my next question. So we were already worried about opioids not containing fentanyl before fentanyl even came on the scene. Now, the thing that keeps me up at night the most is fentanyl.
Right.
And the fact that fentanyl is everywhere, it's in everything. If you could, please speak to that and the rise of fentanyl and how it comes across the border and it gets put in everything, including pills that look like opioids, that look like benzodiazepines like Xanax.
Yeah, the cartel is pretty smart, and they're
very
savvy
smart
about business practices. We could probably learn a lot about logistics and marketing from
and
the
they
cartel
make
themselves.
A ton of money because
do.
it's so cheap to produce. It comes over from China, goes to Mexico, it's put together in pill form, and then it comes across the border and it costs nothing.
No, and yet huge public toll as a result of loss of life. But there's no doubt, it was interesting. I did a panel in Tuscaloosa early on about opioids, and there was a young lady that was in recovery that was there who told a remarkable story about basically being the canary in the mine for the drug dealers, and that she would use so that they would know how good their stuff was. And to some extent, she told the story also about drug dealers really didn't think much about overdose deaths because that just meant they had strong stuff and good stuff. And it was a marketing tool that they use. I mean, look, just a world that we can't get our arms around. But the cartel understood that this was a more intense and significant high and began to see it as a cheaper way of being able to sell as opposed to what methamphetamine cost, what even heroin, because we saw heroin after the sort of the rise of opioids, and then it became fentanyl. And now we're seeing all kind of drugs, marijuana and other things, which are cut with fentanyl to add to the intensity of what they're selling. And it's why, you can get into this political debate about the southern border, and I've been pretty vocal, and people know where I stand on the immigration issue. One of the drivers of my narrative about the reason to secure that border is because that is the way in which a majority of the fentanyl is making it into our country.
Yep.
And the other thing that people don't completely realize is the intensity in which a small amount of fentanyl can impact you, so that you don't have to have, kilo after kilo, because fentanyl is such a powerful drug.
People don't know that the amount of fentanyl that can kill you is contained on a fingernail.
Yeah. Yeah. I always tell people about that sugar packet, 1 gram can kill entire blocks and blocks of people if it's out there.
And yet they're marketing it as meaning the cartels, and just wherever you read about fentanyl, and the drug dealers are saying it is the best high you'll ever have. That is, if it doesn't kill you.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's why, interesting, at least even in my own sort of work around this, there's been times where I've had to challenge what instinctively I didn't want to believe. But, I will say this, Narcan, naloxone, the reversal for somebody that's suffering an overdose. There was a while where I was like, that's not a law enforcement problem, right? I mean, and aren't we just feeding addiction when we give somebody the ability to reverse an overdose, and so they can just willy-nilly use it? Anyway, there was this pushback from me, and it comes a little bit from the law enforcement side of the house.
Yes.
And a rule follower. And I remember sitting in a meeting of that opioid task force, and it was next to a physician, and we were having this discussion because one of the things that the task force was deciding is, do we want to advocate for increased spending on naloxone? Do we want to develop a plan to put it out there? And this was still when it was subject to being prescribed and not over the counter like it is now. And I was speaking in opposition to it, and the physician leaned over and he said, Steve, I've never been able to save somebody who was dead. I can't bring them back to life. And it was a little bit of an epiphany moment for me. I'm like, okay, yeah, I get it. And, look, we all understand, if you've been connected to recovery, that relapse is a part of that process. It's not what anybody wants, but yet it is not uncommon. And particularly for those that have been involved in the criminal justice system, that's our most likely category of individuals to suffer from that overdose death. And interesting, and the reason why is because we get them clean in the criminal justice system, and then they relapse, but they go back to the same levels they were using before, what their body's not prepared to deal with like they were when they were they were hugely using. And so, there's no doubt that even for me and sort of how I've advocated policy-wise, there has been a shift a little bit, just basically learning more and understanding more about addiction and recovery and what is it that we can do that's most effective. Because again, what makes the opioid problem different than say what we dealt with cocaine or what we dealt with methamphetamine, it's the loss of life and numbers that no one would have ever imagined. And we still, I don't think, have crested the hill on where we need to be able to reverse that trend.
I'm glad you've changed your mind about Narcan, because it isn't just that particular group of society that you mentioned who's suffering from overdoses. It's also kids in Mountain Brook.
Yeah.
It's also so many people have the potential to overdose on fentanyl. That's why I myself say every household needs Narcan, every business, every school, because you don't know who has taken a pill that isn't a real pill. So isn't it better to be the smart parent, the prepared parent? It isn't giving permission for the child to use drugs. It's being the prepared workplace or school or household by having Narcan in the home.
Yeah, there's no doubt. And again, if we were having this conversation in 2017, I would have probably pushed back on you about that. But I think it's part of how we have learned that we have to deal with this question.
Yeah.
Again, I will never forget that moment with that physician, and definitely changed my perspective. And I'll say this, I think as a law enforcement community, patrol officer never saw themselves as a first responder. That's fire and rescue, right? They're the ones to help deal with that. But because of many times being the first on the scene, when we began to equip law enforcement with this, we were able to make a bigger difference. And then look, the other thing that we saw also is the exposure to highly concentrated forms of fentanyl was also a issue for law enforcement just in their profession. And we've seen the stories nationally, and having that available to law enforcement to help them was also something that was critically important. And so really, Commissioner Boswell's predecessor, Commissioner Brashear, and Dr. Harris at Public Health, I think worked really hard to figure out how do we get this out? How do we make it available? And now, kind of as you described earlier, before we needed a prescription to get it, now we don't. And so there really isn't an impediment from a regulatory side to be able to have access.
Okay, let's talk about the opioid settlement and the money that Alabama has received. You did something very brave and very bold in not accepting the national settlement, which the allocation model was connected to population. So initially, Alabama would have received far less money by accepting the national settlement, but you were very brave and you pursued the Alabama specific settlement. And we're glad you did, because you got the state of Alabama far more money. Just exactly how much has Alabama received in 2022 and 24? And where's the money going?
Yeah. And by the way, I'm glad it wasn't the crazy and bad decision, because look, it was of all the things I've done, that's the one that was a little sleepless about, because, and as a matter of background, worked collectively with AGs across the country in resolving these cases, because the folks that were being sued, whether they be manufacturers, distributors, or what have you, they wanted to resolve the cases, but it was, hey, we're going to send it to the states and then y'all figure out where you go. And we believed, and you kind of described it, that division of the pie, if you will, should be really specific to the severity of the problem that you have. And candidly, I thought that made perfect sense, and thought everybody else would just embrace that idea. And unfortunately, big states didn't, and they overruled us. And when it came to the first national settlement, which was with McKesson, who we had a pending case on, just didn't feel like that was the way that we wanted to go. And two reasons why. One is, and it's interesting when you just say the numbers, because people would say you really are crazy. But it was a question of whether or not Alabama was going to get about 2.1% under my approach or about 1.5% under the other allocation. So we were talking about 0.6%. And it's like, why do you want to fight about that? Because
because the number was so huge.
Yeah, it was because it was multiple B's,
Billions,
not
yes.
millions.
Right.
And even in the case of McKesson, with a settlement amount that was really significant. I mean, we're talking, $10 or $15 million alone would have mattered to the state of Alabama. And the other thing what I thought was problematic, when everyone collectively around the room agreed, this is the number one public health crisis that we're dealing with in the country, and they decided that they would allow the defendants to pay this amount of money over an 18-year period, I just thought that's not fast enough.
Yeah.
And
how many more people are going to die in the next 18 years?
We can do this more quickly. I need to do it more quickly. And so we said to the McKessons of the world, we're going to go on our own. And so, which means we're going to litigate it in Montgomery. Had a really good team together, really proud of both the private lawyers that worked with us as well as in-house what we did at the AG's office. And we settled the McKesson case on the eve of trial for what would have been roughly $80 million over 18 years for over, it was 124 over half the amount of time. And I remember going home from the first negotiation. This was about a week and a half before trial. And they had gotten up to a little over 100. And I told them no and walked away. And the mediator called me and said, "You've lost your mind." I was like, "No, we're not there." And to resolve it in that way, look, it professionally gratifying because it reaffirmed the decision. But more importantly, I knew that that's lives that we're going to save because it's dollars we didn't have as a state that were then going to be driven into effective programs. And so really pleased with that. We did the same thing with two other of the major players on the distributor side, which was AmerisourceBergen and Cardinal Health. And in that, we settled that case later for, I think it was about $45 million, more and less than half the time, again, in a way that I thought we needed to do. And so really excited that now it's going to be over $800 million is coming to the state of Alabama total over the next decade.
Wow.
We've already distributed significant dollars already. And I got to commend Representative Rex Reynolds, who has kind of led that charge for both the House and the Senate. The idea, and it's a rough summary, but basically half of the money is going to cities and counties to use, half going to the state, but all communities benefit, right? Because of the way the state money can be used. And so it's been weird to watch. Some AGs kept the decision on where to send the money, and I didn't think that was my role. I thought it's the appropriator's opportunity to be able to drive dollars in a way that made sense. But yet, I'm not going to tell you that I'm not a very interested observer in what they do, because the biggest thing that I'm worried about now is, do we use the money effectively? And I think that's yet to be seen. I think there's been some good ideas put in place. The first round of awards of grants from the state, I think, had some good work. I think the real challenge, frankly, is our cities and counties, because they're just not in the business of treatment and recovery. And so how do they use the money? I mean, you see places like Walker County, with Jasper being the epicenter of many of the opioid problems in our state and gets sort of identified around the country. You had a robust effort in that community to develop a plan on what to do to try to address it, when you had other folks that really had no idea. And it's why we actually saw a little bit of a stall when the money was first distributed from the initial settlements. It wasn't being spent because folks just didn't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
And then you've seen really good things, even most recently in Mobile, where they've used very much a data-driven, evidence-based effort to try to target dollars and use them most effectively. And so Mayor Stimson, I think, is doing really good work down there in the decision-making on how to use the dollars. Because I think the greatest fear was that we suddenly stood up 69 websites in counties and say, don't use drugs. That's not what's going to get the bang for the buck.
And that's something you and I were were talking about when we were speaking last week. You said, okay, this is great. We have lots of websites, but websites don't necessarily save lives.
Right.
Thank you to our presenting sponsor, Longleaf Recovery and Wellness. Longleaf Recovery and Wellness is elevating the standard for addiction and mental health treatment in Alabama, offering exceptional and personalized care at centers in Birmingham, Huntsville, and Baldwin County. Life-saving programs offered at Longleaf provide a path to real change and support for a restored life long-term. Learn more about Longleaf Recovery and Wellness at longleafcenters.com. A big thank you to our sponsors, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Alabama and Southern Ketamine and Wellness. Thanks to you, Alabama has $800 million of opioid settlement money. What do you think are the kinds of programs that would be most beneficial?
Yeah, one of the things that we did in the settlement is, and we learned a little bit from the tobacco settlement from years ago, which are where AGs are known. And tobacco settlement is supposed to go to the cessation of the use of tobacco. When what we've seen in Alabama over historically is when the general fund got a little light, it was used to roads and bridges, for other things in the general fund. It wasn't used for the purpose in which it was designed. Now, it's had some good benefits from it, but not always around the topic for which the settlement took place. And so I've sort of described it as flexible guardrails that we have used around this money to say it's got to be used to abate the opioid problem. Now, there's creative ways you can do that. It can be treatment and recovery. There can be some work even on the law enforcement side that is helpful there. But you got to tie the use of the money to the reduction of the harm of opioids. And so we have tried to acknowledge that what may be happening as we sit here in, I think, what are we in Shelby County as we're recording this, may be different than the problem that they're facing in Wilcox County versus what they have in Clark County. And so we want to embrace this idea that it ought to be a local solution to the issues that they're seeing there. But also we want to make sure that, again, this money didn't go for purposes that were anything other than to be able to save lives. Now, look, I've spent most of my time in this area around kind of the recovery house and what's being done by many unique providers to help people that are struggling and getting access to recovery. And so that's where I hope a majority of the money is spent. Particularly, I think it's where it's most effective. And the other thing that we didn't need to do is to create some kind of bureaucracy around this money that isn't driving dollars into treatment and recovery.
Why does that always happen?
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, let's talk about bureaucracy for a minute. You hear that word and you just shudder. Nobody likes bureaucracy, and yet it's everywhere. And bureaucracy, frankly, does not save lives, and it doesn't help people.
No, it doesn't. And look, you have to develop capacity, but yet when you have many that are in the nonprofit space that are also already providing, why don't we just expand capacity there and allow that to be used? Because, and again, I'd say this specifically again for the cities and the counties, they clearly are not in that space. At the state, we do have public health, mental health that are drivers of these areas. But you don't see that at the local level. And, we can get into a much broader policy discussion about, is that effective or not? It's the reality of where we are, and it's what we've had to do. But it's why when I've had conversations with cities and counties, I had a chance to speak about Alabama's approach at the National League of Cities and share there. It's find local programs that work, aggregate your money in a way that makes sense, and allow those people that are already successful to do even more and better things. It's why, you can point to, we were talking earlier about the Love Lady House here in Birmingham. They're doing great stuff around recovery. We don't have to recreate that program because it already exists. And we also know that in situations like, the Foundry or with Love Lady, they're already serving geographically far bigger areas than simply where they're located. So why don't we find mechanisms to make sure that they have the capacity to take people in and to be able to do the good things that they're doing? So,
Right.
I already, as somebody that knows that January 2027 will be the time that I'll exit the role as AG. I do know that this is that area that I'm going to look back on the most and say, did we get it done? And it won't be finished by the time that I'm AG, but I'll be proud of what we've done around the litigation because I think that was important. Now the question is, do we as a state make the right policy decisions that allow for those funds and other programs to be successful?
It's an ongoing battle. And for you, this battle has been personal.
Yeah.
If you would tell us about your wife and what she went through and why this ivy is so important for you.
Yeah, no doubt that there was personal motivation. When I tell you about going to see Kay Ivey about this, I had lived as a result of the struggles of my late wife with somebody that had to deal with this question. And Bridget was a remarkable woman. The world is worse off because she's not here. She was somebody that, as I understand it, goes back to when she was 7 or 8 years old, had just these awful migraines and saw that during our married life. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I stood holding Bridget's hair. She was throwing up in the bathroom because of just the intensity of her headaches. And I watched the way in which that treatment took place. We went to specialty migraine clinic in Chicago to try to help figure out what was the driver of her problems and never could figure out. And so the vehicle that was chosen was pain clinics, and initially was prescribed opioids. And as somebody just being transparent, you just kind of trust a doctor, right? You don't think twice. You just kind of, okay, this is the way you want to approach it. And saw that Bridget struggled with misuse. And we talked about how to get help. And one of the things, and it's why I'm very sensitive to the efforts to deal with the stigma question, is that for Bridget in seeking help, sometimes it was this idea, well, look, I don't need that. That's for other people, not me.
What? Because of shame and stigma?
I think that was part of it. Yeah. That she saw, like, the doctors were telling me to do this. I mean, that's part of what she would say. But also when it clearly was impacting her life, and she knew it. I mean, I think she'd want to be in that spot, but she would just simply say that the seeing somebody that could talk about the abuse of medication was just not for her. That was for other people that needed help. And you can't force somebody into treatment. We actually, she was committed, try to get help that way. But the commitment process is not for somebody that just suffers from addiction. Bridget struggled with severe depressive disorder. I don't really know the term, and anxiety. And so it was this awful combination, frankly, that came together that other people struggle with. And then, look, this is one of those things that makes me shudder even to talk about. I remember she was coming home from one of her visits and said, hey, we got to go to this compounding pharmacy because they prescribed what she told me was breakthrough pain when she had really, really bad migraines. And it was this drug called fentanyl. And I'm like, okay, well, I guess we'll go get it, having no idea at all about how powerful that drug was. And looking back, the other thing that I'm struck by, and I think we do better about this now, is there was very little coordination between the people that she was seeing for pain, the people that she was seeing for mental health treatment, and those that she just encountered as a result of just day-to-day life with medical problems. And hopefully we're smarter about it now than we were. But for Bridget, it just became this downward spiral and struggle to the point that she ultimately took her life. And was on the phone with her right before it happened. And just, these words will always echo with me when she said, I'm tired of being tired. And, it was just this idea for her that she didn't see a way out. And, it's a place that, is a family that it's interesting to hear the word suicide survivor. I never knew what that meant. And I remember at our visitation, somebody came up and gave me a hug and said, "Welcome to the fraternity." I didn't know what that meant, and later learned that they had lost somebody to suicide. And you always have the what ifs and the what could we have done differently, and what could have changed that course of that tragedy. And you never have the full answers. And even my whole life, and I bared my soul at a press conference after her death, because as a family, we thought we need to share a story, hoping that we can change other people's lives
and
one
help other people.
We've seen, and look, my faith is paramount in my life, and Romans 8:28 became very much a living verse in my own spiritual walk. But I mean, literally after, this is before Bridget's funeral, and when they held the press conference, somebody reached out to say, "You saved our life today." Stopped all over the state for people to be able to share their own personal stories and their lives. It's one of the things that's kind of strange as a public figure. Sometimes people don't see you as a real person. Right. And I had somebody that kind of said, we understand now you face the same struggles that we all face, or your families face the same issues that we face. So it was really kind of a weird humanizing effect for me with people in the state. But I do think as a result of her death, it put a spotlight on the issue that may never have taken place. And look, I can't sit here and tell you today that's a good thing, in the sense of, because her being here is a better thing than that. And that's just completely selfish on my part. But it was a result, and it was a consequence of the fact that me being a public figure, her death and the circumstances of her death raised that to another level. And so, it remains something that I think about a lot. And also, my in-laws, remarkable people. I give them a great deal of credit for believing that sharing that story has been a good thing, because I don't know that always takes place.
Your wife did not die in vain.
We want to believe that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And even for our daughter, I mean, she's been a little bit of a crusader around discussing mental health. Yes. And I don't think that would have been a platform at all, right, for what was a personal family struggle. But I think big picture, hopefully there's positive that's come from that.
Well, I think your transparency has no doubt helped an untold number of people. I have no doubt. And you strike me as a very modest person, which is also a wonderful quality to have.
You can.
But I can tell you, as someone who has worked in the space for a long time, that you have helped people. Wow. And the fact that 3 days after Bridget's death, you decided to talk about her and to be honest about what had happened, that set you apart from others who choose to stay silent about their loved ones. And when we stay silent about things, we cannot help others. And so for you to share your wife's struggles and to eventually talk about the failure of the system, meaning your wife was prescribed certain drugs that ended up failing her, and the fact that she needed help, but she didn't want to be labeled. All of these things that you have shared publicly can only help people.
Well, I hope so. And I'll say this, that, there's no doubt as a family member experiencing that with a loved one, there's just this idea of where to turn. Because, you think, again, turn to doctors and mental health professionals was the direction to go. And I just don't know that collectively that she was served as well as maybe that she should have. And I'm not trying to place blame there by any stretch, as much as it's just the reality of where we were at that time with opioids, particularly around prescribing, because Bridget's wasn't illicit drugs, everything she had that she was prescribed there. But there's no doubt that it did not, sort of the efforts to deal with the migraine problems did not coalesced very well with the mental health struggles. And I think they exacerbated one another in many respects.
Of course they did. And unfortunately, what happened to Bridget has happened to far too many Americans and far too many Alabamians. And so, again, I want to thank you for being so open about Bridget and her struggle, because people do look at someone like you, the Attorney General of the state of Alabama, and think, well, he doesn't go through hard things. Famous people or politicians or whatever, they don't struggle the way we do. And so you're putting a face on mental health struggles. And then the fact that you're Attorney General and can actually make changes.
Yeah, it's funny.
I can't think of a better person to do this than someone who has struggled himself.
So, even in my own internal sort of healing, that's been a little bit of a driver, because it's, you're always after the fact saying, what can I do? And uniquely, it didn't take long to look in the mirror and say, come on, man, you've got an opportunity here professionally to be able to do things. But, the other is still, I think it's, as somebody that back in the prosecutor days, when people would come see you and say, my loved one's struggling with addiction, what do I do? You just see this feeling of helplessness because people don't know where to turn, because it's not, we can't compel people into treatment and recovery. It's just, that's not a vehicle to do it. People really have to make that decision for themselves. And I think there's an awful lot of people, whether directly affected by the issue of misuse and addiction, or on the family member side or the friend side, there's probably not many in Alabama that have not been impacted by it. And I think that's probably a little bit, because you do sometimes feel like you're the only one. And maybe it's a little bit of the work in the criminal justice system, because I was exposed to it and saw it. And so I maybe more so than most realize that it's bigger than maybe most understand, but especially around opioids, because it was a prescribed medication that it was viewed a little bit differently. And look, we've all heard the stories, and look, if I look at Bridget's family history, I clearly believe there's a genetic connection to what she was struggling with and dealt with.
Yes.
And I think we are beginning to learn more and more about that too, which is good. But I'm grateful for the fact that in my professional life, that there was a tangible way for me to try to move forward from that terrible time in a way that I don't want to say make Bridget proud. That doesn't sound right. But at least for there to be this sense that she would see from her desperation and struggle, that maybe there are others now that aren't still struggling in the same way that she did.
Exactly. And you shared with me that you get notes from people all the time. And you said you got a Facebook message once that said, "You saved my life."
Yeah, that was on the day of the press conference.
So you are saving lives. And if you would, tell me what that meant to you when you got that note that said, "You saved my life." You told me it was a transcendent moment from God.
Yeah, I got that. Still, the press conference that we did at Bridget's family's church that day, I don't even remember. It was just,
I'm sure you don't.
Felt like an out-of-body experience because it was so raw. And I don't know that I've ever felt more spent from what we did that day. And yet, because it was so close in time to her death, and still such an emotional period, you have no idea whether that decision was right or not, right? I remember really, I think it was on a Wednesday, if I'm not mistaken, but we sat around as a family on Tuesday night to say, what do we do? It was like, what do we do? It was Bridget's brothers and my sister-in-law and her mom and dad and my daughter. And that's when we made the decision that we were going to do it. But you don't know if it's the right thing or not. And there's still, I think I shared this with you, there's still this idea a little bit, am I betraying that trust and that there's a reason why we have a legal privilege in the law relating to marital communications, right? I mean, you want to preserve the integrity of that relationship. And, so when you decide to bear some of that, was it the right thing to do? And so the fact that we got that message so quickly afterwards was a validator of the decision that we made. But it's really been more of the interactions just in random places, grocery stores, convenience stores, city parks, that's been helpful. And then I had a chance, I think it was maybe the second event in Railroad Park. Initially, it was called the Heroin Walk. Now it's a little bit more. And I remember speaking in front of that crowd there a little bit about Bridget's life and what was going on in the state. And it was very much in that moment, this sense of community in a way that I had probably not experienced before, because there was a shared experience out in that group. And I still have to this day a picture looking behind me into that crowd. And every once in a while I look at that picture and see the faces and think, what's your connection here? Because you don't really show up at an event like that just to go team, right? I mean, it's usually because you've been impacted by it in some way. And so it's kind of like this idea of what's your story? And in some ways, it'd be nice if you could record all those as an oral history to understand the depth and the in some ways the width of this problem. But that was a moment that I will remember only because it was just very much for me this idea that I'm part of this.
And thank goodness you are here to share your history with us and our audience.
Yeah, because the hope is that we're not having to share these stories by others, right? I mean, it's that we don't want to be in a space that's not going to happen. Reality is we're going to be there.
That's right. We will be there.
To minimize the numbers, to maximize the success of what we're trying to do, I think is the end game.
You mentioned Romans 8:28 earlier, and I just want to read that verse for people who may be unfamiliar. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, and for those who are called according to his purpose. It is one of the most well-known verses in the Bible. And some say that this verse means that God works in all things to refine our faith, to strengthen us to keep going, to develop character, if you will. And this verse seems to sum you up perfectly.
Yeah, you don't want to deal with the hard times, right? But yet, who's the famous country singer about "We Never Promised a Rose Garden"? I'm sure that was Loretta Lynn or Tammy Wynette, right? The prophet that they are. But no, there's no doubt that in the aftermath of her death, that there had to be something to latch onto, and that was for me. And it's also a unique period in which I palpably felt prayer. People that I knew that were lifting up our family, because that was the other thing about you want to grieve in private. I mean, that's just a very private thing. But being a public figure, it was like you didn't have the ability to do that as much as you desperately wanted to. But the thing that I didn't appreciate about the public nature of her death and that grief was it also caused this army of people to wrap their arms around our family in prayer and to be able to feel that. And there was remarkable comfort there that otherwise maybe wouldn't have existed. But it is no doubt the moment in my life where I felt an absolute sense that I need God. And so it was a moment. And it's probably why, the willingness even within the survivors of suicide community the ability to embrace that. Because, it's interesting, those that are recovering from that, it's a very similar sort of idea to going to meetings and being a part of recovery and addiction. There's a recovery component to the trauma that's connected to that.
Of course. And faith sees us through.
For sure.
I like to say that God didn't bring us this far to dump us now.
Yeah, he created beautiful things and he has a plan.
Yes, and even if we don't see the blessing in something right away, and it's hard to when we lose a loved one, there is a beauty and there is a blessing, even if we don't see it in the moment. Because look what you have done for the people of Alabama.
Well,
just in the last few years.
Very great. So, I had a chance to go to the University of South Alabama a couple weeks ago. Remarkable effort by a mother who lost her son, where her nonprofit has paintings, black and whites, of those that have overdosed within a narrative of their life story to place a story with a face that we have lost. And I think, sometimes I'm a little careful about sharing statistics about overdose deaths and numbers, because these are moms and dads, brothers and sisters, sons and daughters. And we don't need to lose sight of the fact that each of these individuals are real people. It's kind of this, the prosecutor in me, is somebody that's prosecuted in many murder cases, it's incumbent upon me in that role to share the story of the victim, that they don't get lost in everything. And I was really struck by this exhibit that they're taking around the country that's state specific, that gives the story of uniquely of their loved ones, and had a family member come up for one of them that was from Marshall County, where I was before, and I knew his story because I knew a little bit about the background there and talked to people afterwards for a little bit more. And I think, again, for everybody, there's a different way to try to find an outlet. But these are all constructive ways to help make sure that maybe somebody else is not in the same space.
Final question for you. What are you most hopeful about moving forward?
That I think that we are in the right direction. I don't see, we're not the Alabama of 2017. I don't think we're the Alabama of 2022, because now I think there is money, and money's not the solver of the problem, just to make this clear, but there are resources there that we didn't have before that I see people using for good reasons. And so I'm excited about where the future's going to be, because that means that we're going to save more lives than we would have been able to before.
Alabama's Attorney General Steve Marshall, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
No, thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to One Day at a Time, a Yellowhammer News podcast presented by Longleaf Recovery and Wellness. Be sure to follow Yellowhammer News on Instagram, Facebook, and X. And follow me, Laurie, on Facebook and Instagram.